Hello, we're going to be in 1 Kings chapter 11 today. This is a sad chapter. This is a chapter that shows a great man, warts and all. You know, the Bible is unique because it really presents men the way they are. There is no such thing as a super saint, super believer. We're just men made of dust that God calls and uses. There was such promise in Solomon, called one of the wisest men that ever lived, but what a fool his life turned out to be. You know, the Jews say that Solomon wrote Song of Songs in his youth, Proverbs in his middle years, and Ecclesiastes in his old age. Well, I can understand that because in his old age, Solomon's heart was drawn away from the Lord. And that's what this chapter is all about, the consequences of going against God's covenant. Let's look at it then. Now, King Solomon loved many foreign women. Now, back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verses 14 through 17, it talked about that. It talked about, do not, first of all, have many wives, don't have many horses, and don't have much wealth. And yet every one of those Solomon accumulated. For the many wives, it's this chapter here. For the much horses, it's chapter 10, verses 26 and following. And for the much wealth, it's chapter 10, verses 4 and following. Everything God said would happen, happened. You know, prosperity is a hard thing to handle, isn't it? Boy, we think things we think are such great blessings, in the end, sometimes are the curses of our lives, because the times of success and prosperity and health tend to draw our hearts into self-sufficiency. Poor Solomon. Along with the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, notice that Pharaoh's daughter is mentioned separate from the other foreign wives. Now, why? Well, it was never a scriptural mandate not to marry Egyptians. Now, it did say don't marry Canaanite women, and that's Deuteronomy 7, 1 through 3. But never don't marry Egyptian women. Now, the rabbis say that this Pharaoh's daughter became a proselyte because none of the gods that are listed in the verses that follow this are Egyptian gods. Boy, I hope that's true. I hope that young lady came to know the Lord. Notice then, it mentions Moabite, Amorite, Edomite, Sidonian. Now that would be probably the daughter of Hiram, king of Tyre, where he got all of his building materials from, and the Hittite women. Now most of these were political alliances. This was not passion that did this. Solomon's an old man. This is political alliances. This is convenience. This is to have a court in Israel like the other Oriental courts. Remember back in our study of Samuel where the people said, we want a king like the other kings? Well, boy, they had one in Solomon, and they reaped the whirlwind of it. Now, Hittite, that's unusual. There is a major empire known as the Hittite Empire around the 1300 BCs in what we know as modern Turkey or Central Asia Minor. Whether this is exactly the same group or just a different kind of group of Canaanites, we're really not sure. Let me tell you why. There is an archaeological treaty that was found in 1300 BC between the Hittites and the Egyptians that's kind of split Palestine and Syria up. So it's possible it was an incipient form of this later Hittite Empire. But we find some people called Hittites mentioned in Genesis 23, in Numbers 13:29, and here in 1 Kings 11 that seems too far removed from what we know as the major Hittite Empire. So I'm not sure if it's the same racial group or not. Maybe it's two different groups with the same name. I'm just not sure there. Now, from the nations concerning which the Lord had said to the sons of Israel, you shall not associate with them, neither shall you associate with you, and you shall surely turn your heart to other gods. It's not interracial marriage that's talked about here. These were all Semitics. It's interreligious marriage that's talked about here. And boy, we see the results of this in Solomon's life. Solomon held fast to these in love. And he had 700 wives, princesses, that shows the political alliance part, 300 concubines. Now they're kind of halfway between a slave and a wife. They are sexually permissible partners. They have some legal rights, but they're not full wives. Their children don't inherit automatically. And his wives turned his heart away. Boy, you think, what a man. 1,000 wives. How'd have to go Christmas shopping with 1,000 women? Well, it's a totally different system. We can't even compare it with ours. But it does show the major problems that can happen when we try to make our lives like the world. Most of this was political, and in his old age, Solomon bent over backwards to make them happy, and in so doing, he gave offense to Yahweh. Notice it says here, and it came about when Solomon was old, his wives turned his heart away after other gods. Now people wonder, because of verse 5 it says Solomon went after, did Solomon himself participate in these idolatrous feasts? I don't know. Obviously, to do all this, like offer incense and burn sacrifice, then in verse 8, these women had to import their own priest. And to do it, Solomon built them a place to worship in Jerusalem. And that's what I think his participation was building them a place to worship and providing food and housing for their priest and all the accoutrements of this religious system. I do not think personally that Solomon participated, but I think he did that, built the place, and took care of the entourage that followed these kind of gods. Now, notice what it says here. His heart was not wholly devoted as his father David was. Now, what does that mean? Well, David, boy, he was a real dummy. He had warts and all, didn't he? My goodness, what a man that made some really foolish errors. And yet, what a man with great faith. What a man with great faith. I think God is not going to hold it against us that we blow it from time to time, but it's that our heart is tuned toward Him. Solomon's heart went after these other women. David's heart stayed with the Lord, even though he did the same kinds of sins as Solomon did. Now, for Solomon went after Ashtaroth. Now, Ashtaroth is the female fertility god of the Canaanite pantheon. Now, here it says the goddess of the Sidonians. Now, there is no word in Hebrew for goddess. Now, the Sidonians, again, is Tyre and Sidon, the Phoenicians. Originally, Baal and Astarte, or Ashtaroth, were Phoenician fertility gods that came through Jezebel and permeated the people of God. Now, that's in the future is Jezebel, of course. But this same kind of, it was started in Phoenicia, it moved down into Canaan or Palestine. It was the fertility worship that pulled Israel's heart away from the Lord. Now, notice it says, and Milcom. Now, Milcom seems to be related with the god mentioned down in verse 7, Molech. Milcom and Molech both seem to be a slight corruption of the Hebrew word for king, Melech. Now, Milcom is the god of the Amorites. He's a war god. Now, Molech, down in verse 7, is a god, a fire god, also Phoenician fire god, that we think was worshipped by offering the firstborn child alive into the fire. Now, we have we have no historical evidence that it was a bronze statue seated, and you put the fire inside of him, and you lay the child on his arms. That's all presupposition. We don't know. It was done in the valley of the sons of Hinnom, one of the valleys of Jerusalem even. The Jews hated that so much they spit whenever they heard it. They made that valley a garbage dump. When Jesus wants to talk about hell, he talks about Gehenna. Ge is the Hebrew for valley, and Hinnom, the valley of the sons of Hinnom, where this god Molech was worshipped. The Jews just hated it. You might want to see Leviticus 18:21, 20 verse 5, 2 Kings 23:10 for this god Molech, which seemed related to Milcom. Now, it mentions that and Solomon went and did what was evil on the side of the Lord, and did not follow the Lord fully, as his father David had done. Then Solomon built a high place for Chemosh, the detestable idol of Moab. Now, Chemosh is a war and sun god. He's mentioned in Numbers 21:29 and 2 Kings 23:13. Now, these high places are interesting. The high places were used for the fertility gods, up on the bald hills or under the green trees surrounding us, where their fertility acts went on. Now, this is mentioned back in chapter 3, verses 2 and 3. Solomon worshiped on the high places because the temple wasn't finished. But once the temple was totally finished, the high places are outlawed. And yet they are local shrines that are not really done away with until Josiah's time. Okay? On the mountain east of Jerusalem, guess where Solomon built this temple to Chemosh? On the Mount of Olives. And Molech, the detestable idol of the sons of Ammon. Okay? Thus also he did for all his foreign wives who burn incense and sacrifice to their gods. Every foreign wife he had wanted her own temple. And Solomon did it. Now the Lord was angry with Solomon. No kidding. because his heart was turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. What made it so bad is God had personally come to Solomon. You might want to see chapter 3, verse 5, chapter 9, verse 2. That tremendous experience of the dedication of the temple. And yet Solomon had the spiritual dumbness to go after these foreign idols and even bring them into Jerusalem. Golly. And had commanded him concerning this thing that he should not go after other gods, but he did not observe what the Lord had commanded. And so the Lord said to Solomon, because you, and boy, it's an emphatic one here, have done this, and you have not kept my covenant, my statutes, what I command you, I will surely tear the kingdom from you and give it to your servant. The sin of the king affected all the people. Friends, I want to tell you, the leadership is important. The leadership of the church is important. The leadership of Israel was important. As that leader went, so went the people. Now, the word tear here seems to be significant. In verses 29 and 30, the prophet is going to use a robe as a symbol and tearing it into 12 pieces. Maybe that symbolic act by the prophet Ahijah is related to God's word that I'll tear the kingdom from you. I don't know. But notice here in verse 14, then the Lord raised up an adversary to Solomon. Now the word Solomon is a derivative of the word peace, shalom. Solomon's related to shalom. And so instead of peace, he's going to raise up adversaries. Now the word adversaries is the basic root of the Hebrew word Satan. Okay? And God's in control of history. God's going to raise these men up. God's in control of individuals. God's in control of nations. God's in control of destiny. Friends, God's sovereign over all creation. So he's going to raise up 3 different enemies. Now the first one's mentioned in verse 14, Hadad the Edomite. The second in verse 23, Rezon, another one here. And verse 26, Jeroboam. Now, Hadad was an Edomite. Now, David had almost totally destroyed the Edomites, and you can see it in your parallel passage. I believe it's 2 Samuel 8, 13, and 14. Now, Hadad somehow escaped and went to Egypt. Hadad is kind of a name for all of the leaders of Edom, kind of like Pharaoh's a name for all the leaders of Egypt. It may be a family name from Genesis 25:15 and Genesis 36:35. It's either a family name or it's a title, and I'm not sure which it is from history. Now, verse 16 mentions about Joab and all Israel stayed 6 months. They cut off every male in Edom. Boy, 1 Chronicles 18:12. This one guy was left, and he came back and caused them the miseries. And they arose from Midian, that's kind of like a large area like Arabia, and came to Paran, that's the desert south of Judea. And they took men with them from Paran and came to Egypt, and Pharaoh, king of Egypt, gave him a house and assigned him food. Now, this obviously was not Solomon's father-in-law. It must have been a new Pharaoh who didn't particularly care for Solomon, right? Must be. He gave this man refuge. They became great friends, apparently, and he was very sorry when the man left. Matter of fact, he even gave the queen's sister to him to marry. Look at verse 19. Now, this Tamphis, we have no list of her in Egyptian records, so we don't know why. Notice a little bit further. Let's see. Let's talk about Rezin for a minute then. Rezin, the son of Eldah, who fled from the Lord Hadadzer, the king of Zobath, and he gathered men to himself and became leader of marauding band after David slew them at Zobah. This is 2 Samuel 8, about verses 3 through 8, then chapter 10, verses 6 through 18. Okay? And they went to Damascus and stayed there and reigned in Damascus. Now, Hadad becomes a very important name for the leaders of Damascus also. Now, notice that the next great enemy, and he was probably the chief enemy, is Jeroboam the first. He's mentioned in verse 26, son of Nebat. His name means enlarger, or the one who enlarges. And he's an Ephraimite. There's a lot of jealousy between Judah, which of course David and Solomon were from Judah, and Ephraim, for Ephraim was the other large, strong tribe. And that tribal jealousy probably has something to do with the split. For here in this chapter, we're going to have the terrible ripping of the people of God into 2 kingdoms. It's going to happen in 922 when Solomon dies and Rehoboam, his son, becomes king. The straw that broke the camel's back was taxation for the palace, for the monarchy. But there's a whole lot of undercurrent underneath that. From 922 on, the northern 10 tribes are going to be called Israel, Ephraim, or Samaria. And the southern 2 are going to be called Judah. Okay? Jeroboam the first is the one who's going to do it. Now, in verse 27 it says, Solomon built the Milo. Now the Milo, it means to fill, and so we think it's some kind of defense for Jerusalem, okay? David built the Milo also. You might want to see 2 Samuel 5:9, 1 Chronicles 11:8, okay? But he built it with forced labor. Now there's some discrepancy here, for in chapter 9:22 it says that Solomon did not use forced labor. And yet there's so many other passages that say that he did use forced labor. You might want to see 1 Kings 9:15 and 24, and 1 Kings 5:13. So Solomon is abusing his monarchy, but not only drafting men into the military, but drafting men into labor forces to do all his building projects. And that really made the Israelites mad. And so there was already a bone of contention there. Jeroboam was a labor leader for the Ephraimitic allotment. And he was apparently very good. And Solomon recognized that and made him a foreman, okay? Now the prophet Ahijah, the Shilohite, now Shiloh is also in Ephraim, but he's a pretty fair prophet, because in chapter 14, verse 6 and following, he's going to condemn Jeroboam. For Jeroboam had the greatest promise. God said, I'll be with you, I'll raise you up a nation, and all that. But Jeroboam is the one who starts the idolatrous practice of the golden calf at Dan and Beersheba. Dan and Bethel. And so all of that he promised him, the same problem that Solomon had about idolatry, Jeroboam the first had. Now Jeroboam the first probably rationalized and said, well, I don't want to go to Jerusalem because they'll get caught up with the worship of Judah. I'll just start my own shrines. But still, it was idolatry. Now, took the robe and tore it in 12 pieces, one for each tribe, and gave 10 to Jeroboam. Now notice in verse 31, 10 tribes, and in verse 32, 1 tribe. Now the Septuagint has 2 tribes in verse 32. I want to think through this with you for a minute. There's originally 12 tribes, okay? Now Joseph had 2 of his sons inherited his part, and that's, of course, Ephraim and Manasseh. So now we have 13 tribes, really, because Joseph turns into 2. Well, if you divide it between 10, you've got 3 in the south, right? Because the Levites are counted with the northern 10. Judah was also made up. Simeon was incorporated in Judah very early. And Benjamin went with Judah. So the southern tribe is really Simeon, Judah, and Benjamin. And the other tribes, the northern tribes, are what's left. And that's how we get this division here. For the sake of my servant David, look at verse 32. He's going to leave part of the tribe with Solomon's seed. Well, that was to fulfill the great promise of a Davidic king, which was a foreshadowing of Jesus the Messiah in 2 Samuel chapter 7. And so it's very important that Judah remains intact, okay? Now here these goddesses again, Ashtaroth, Chemosh, and Milcom, are mentioned in verse 33. Now, verse 34. Nevertheless, I will take the whole kingdom out. I will not take the whole kingdom out of his hand, but I will make him ruler all the days of his life for the sake of my servant David, whom I chose, who observed my commandments. Now here's the radical paradox between God's sovereignty and man's free will. God chose David. It says it right here, whom I chose. And then David obeyed my commandments. Do you see how God's choice and man's free will always go together? They're 2 sides of one coin. I've done a tape called Predestination and Free Will. I hope you'll send for our catalog of almost 3,000 teaching tapes now, and we'll provide the catalog to you free, and you can look up this subject, Predestination and Free Will. Now in verse 36, but to his son I will give 1 tribe, my servant David may be a lamp always before me in Jerusalem. Now the term lamp is a very interesting concept. It seems to be the idea of a promised seed. And you might want to see 2 Samuel 21:17 and 1 Kings 15:4. It may be the idea of a light or guidance. You may see Psalms 132:17. Or it may be simply an idea of a home. And that's, of course, may be here. Now Jerusalem was the special place that God called his name to dwell in the book of Deuteronomy and Joshua. And it was protected. It was important for the Davidic promises, for the messianic promises to come fulfilled. Verse 37. And I will take you, and you shall reign over whatever you desire, and you will be king over Israel. From here on, Israel refers the name of the northern 10 tribes. It's also called Ephraim. It's also called Samaria. Okay? It's kind of confusing from here on out who Israel refers to. Originally, Jacob's name was changed to Israel. Originally referred to all the Jewish people. Now it's just the northern 10 tribes. Then it will be if, notice the conditional element. There's always a conditional element in God's covenants. If you will listen to all that I command you and walk in my ways, lifestyle faith, obedience and lifestyle faith, and do what is right in my sight by observing my statutes and my commandments, as my servant David did, then I will be with you. What a promise. That's the same one he made with Moses. That's the same one he made with Joshua. He's making that to Jeroboam the first. And build you an endearing house, as I built for David, and I will give Israel to you. Man, this is almost a covenant renewal for this guy. These are the promises of God to this man, if he'll just walk before God in faith. But he won't. We learn from the New Testament that he can't. For the Old Testament was given to show man's sinfulness. That's what Galatians chapter 3 is all about. The purpose of the Old Testament was to show us we can't. With the greatest promises of God, with God visiting us personally, by seeing His great acts in history. We can't do it. It's the history of repeated failure. Now, notice where it says, and thus I will inflict the descendants of David, but not always. Well, that seems to be a reference that God's going to bring the messianic promises to bear. There's going to be renewal of Judea. That's what it seems to be saying. Now, verse 40. Solomon sought, therefore, to put Jeroboam to death. What is he trying to do? Well, it's just like us, you know. God told Saul he was going to do it to David, and Saul tried to kill David. Here, the same thing, Solomon. Does Solomon really think that if God's going to do it, that Solomon can stop it? Well, I don't know, but he does. For Jeroboam arose and fled to Egypt, to Shishak, king of Egypt. Now, Shishak is the first Pharaoh mentioned by name in the Bible. And therefore, we can date it from here for certain. Shishak ascended to the throne in Egypt in 980 or 983 B.C. So here we got a date for this. The split's going to come officially in 922. But this is Shishak. Now, in verse 41 and following, it's kind of a summary. The parallel passage is found in 2 Chronicles 9:29. You might want to read that. It talks about how Solomon's acts are all recorded. And notice the 40 years. And thus the time that Solomon reigned in Jerusalem over all Israel was 40 years. Now, Josephus says 80 years. 40 seems to be a long period of indefinite time. Now, there are some places where it's very specific and very technically dated, is the way they dated. But it rained 40 days and 40 nights. They were in the wilderness wandering period, 40 days. Solomon reigned 40 years. Moses on the Mount of Sinai, 40 days and 40 nights. Jesus was tempted 40 days. I really think they didn't have calendar watches, so it's a long period of indefinite time. And so maybe that's why Josephus put 80. Maybe it's longer than literal 40 years. We're just not certain. But it's that ambiguous element in the Hebrew. And Solomon slept with his fathers. Now, that's where Jesus picks up on the word of death as sleep. When he says the little girl's not dead, she's asleep, everybody laughed. Well, sleep was a way of talking about death from the Old Testament. It doesn't mean an unconscious state necessarily. It just means death. Now, with the fathers, these kings were buried in royal tombs. And maybe it's the concept that they were just stacked up, their bodies were just laid together. But it may also be the idea that there's some kind of familyness in Sheol. And I'm not real sure about that. I know that we're going to know our relatives and friends, but the mystery is we'll be as close to everyone as we are to those who are the most intimately related to us now. And so I'm not sure all the implications. And was buried in the city of his father David, and his son Rehoboam reigned in his place. Now remember, the names are very close. Rehoboam is Solomon's son. Jeroboam is the Ephraimitic labor leader. The kingdom is going to split 10 tribes northward, Jeroboam, the power of Ephraim. And that's going to be called Israel, Ephraim, or Samaria. Now the 3 southern tribes are going to stay with the lineage of David. And so the Davidic kings are going to keep right on going. The northern 10 tribes are going to be taken captive for their continual sin in 722. They existed 200 years, from 922 to 722, and that's when Assyria is going to take them captive. The southern 3 tribes are going to stay autonomous somewhat, all the way until 586 BC, when they're going to be taken captive by Babylon. And so this idolatry continues. This terrible seed that was sowed back in the conquest will come to fruition in the exile of God's people from the promised land. And the Jews kept on going after these foreign gods until that period of Exodus. The Exodus finally cured Israel of idolatry. What a price had to be paid. Notice the faithfulness of God through all these years. Aren't you glad it's God's love for us and not our merit of His love? Aren't you glad it's God's acts and not our acts? Aren't you glad it's who God is in Jesus Christ and not who we are that keeps us right with Him? The Old Testament is a beautiful picture, if you can call it beautiful, of God's love and man's unlove, of God's faithfulness and man's unfaithfulness. And that's what this continuing story is. Even a man like Solomon, the wisest man that ever lived, they say, caught in the trap of idolatry. Well, be careful. Walk after the Lord. Obey Him. Follow Him all your days. But even if you blow it, I want you to know He's still faithful. He still cares. Sin will always run its course. Solomon's sin ripped this kingdom apart, caused exile and pain and problems. Sin always has its consequences. But God can always be depended on. I've enjoyed being with you. I'll see you again, same time, same place, next week. God bless you.